Welcome to Divcasts from the University of Chicago Divinity School. For more of our podcasts and information about our terms of use, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts.
Thank you. So, our this session is Professor Enrico Raffaelli, who comes to us from the University of Toronto, where he is the Associate Professor of the History of Zoroastrianism. A really fascinating topic, as you will probably agree. His research focuses on Zoroastrianism in the pre-Islamic period, and he has authored several articles on this topic, as well as 2 books, The Characterizing in Zoroastrianism, a book which focuses on a Zoroastrian text which worships divine entities, and L'Oroscopo del Mondo, an Italian book that discusses the birth chart of the world and of the first man. Today, Professor Raffaelli will be speaking to us about astrology and religion in the 9th century Zoroastrian texts. Professor Raffaelli, please.
So, my presentation is focused on the way in which astrology was integrated into the corpus of the Zoroastrian religious doctrines in the Sasanian period, 3rd to 7th century of the Common Era. My analysis is based on some passages of astrological contents found in the Zoroastrian text in Pahlavi or Middle Persian that date from the early Islamic times, but are based on texts of the Sasanian period. Before proceeding to this analysis, it is important to review some relevant points of the history of the astral doctrines in pre-Islamic Iran. I will begin with the role played by the celestial bodies in the Avesta, the collection of the sacred texts of Zoroastrianism. The Avestan texts were probably, let's say possibly, composed between the 10th and the 4th century BC in the eastern part of the Iranian world. Given their chronology, of course, these texts do not contain any trace of astrological doctrines in the proper sense, nor do they bear any trace of the astromantic or of the proto-astrological doctrines that had been and were being developed by the neighbors of the Iranians, the Mesopotamians. What we find in the Avesta is a form of astrology, that is, veneration of astral bodies, including the sun and the moon, and some stars, among which Sirius Tishtya is prominent. To this star is dedicated in particular one of the most interesting Avestan hymns, the so-called Tishtar Yashta, which hails Sirius' beneficial power, especially its role in the distribution of rain to the world. According to the hymn, Sirius is the head of the fixed stars that fight and eventually win against the demons causing the drought. Prominent among these demons are the shooting stars. So the clash between the good fixed stars and the demonic shooting stars is a manifestation of the clash between order and disorder that, according to Zoroastrian theology, animates all levels of cosmic existence. In the Western worldview, the regular movement of the fixed stars is considered a reflection of their being good and orderly creatures, whereas the disorderly nature of the shooting stars is on the contrary shown by their unpredictable movements, which make them look like they attack the other stars, and by their unlawfully breaking the boundaries between the celestial and the earthly world by falling to the earth. The Avestan view of the celestial world as a battlefield between good and evil forces is the foundation of the perspective on the astral bodies in the Sasanian theology. It then bears remembering how it is certain that during the Achaemenid period, at least the Western Iranians became familiar with the Mesopotamian proto-astrological doctrines. An indirect indication of that comes from the names of the zodiacal signs and of the planets in Middle Persian, names which probably derive from Old Persian, the language of Persia under the Achaemenids. In fact, the Pahlavi names of some of the zodiacal signs have an equivalent in Akkadian. I apologize if I backed the slide, but you have handouts. That's what handouts are for. Now, 4 planets then are named after gods and also have an equivalent in Akkadian, and the name of Saturn, that is Kevan, is an actual loanword from Akkadian. It must be added that the appellation of 4 planets out of 5 after gods is in blatant contrast with the consideration of these celestial bodies in the Pahlavi text as demons, about which I will talk later. Clearly, when, presumably during the Sasanian period, the planets were demonized, their names had been commonly used for too long to be changed, despite the fact that they might puzzle the faithful and the priests. Now, turning now to astrology, it must be underlined that only from the Sasanian period do we have evidence that this science with quotation marks, was diffused in Iran, even though it is possible that Iranians became familiar with it already under the Parthians, the dynasty ruling before the Sasanians. In the Sasanian period, astrology was popular among people belonging to different classes and to different religions, including, in addition to Zoroastrianism, Manichaeism and Mazdakism. Of this popularity, the Pahlavi text contained the most direct and conspicuous traces. As I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, the Pahlavi texts were composed or ultimately compiled in the early Islamic period, specifically in the 9th to 10th century, but ultimately originate from the Sasanian period, as they are based on or are re-elaborations of Sasanian texts. It has been sometimes assumed that the references to astrology in the Pahlavi texts are due to some sort of influence from Zoroastrianism, a Zoroastrian heterodox current, popular in the Sasanian period, chiefly in Persia, which postulated that Zurvan, the god of time, was the first god. Some space to astrological themes is indeed devoted in the only 2 texts of the Zoroastrian literature to which we may attribute a Zurvanite ascendancy. Both of them are in New Persian. One is the Ulama Islam, the Doctors of Islam, a work that cannot be earlier than the 13th century or later than the 16th century, and the other text is included in a collection of texts called the Rebayat of the Sturbarzu campaign, which dates from the 17th century. On the other hand, the Zurvanite myth, as we know it from sources dating from or chronologically close to the Sasanian period itself, does not contain any theme or concept that may be labeled as astrological, even in the broad sense. The myth says that Zurvan generated 2 sons, one of whom, the god Ormazd, was the fruit of his sacrifice, and the other one, the demon Ahriman, was the result of a doubt that he had about the effectiveness of his sacrifice. Now, yes, therefore, we can affirm, that's actually my opinion, is that the consideration of the god of time as the first god could have led the Zurvanites to emphasize the importance of the study of time and its passing, the passing of time, one form of which was astrology, but that did science, quotation marks here, did not play in the Zurvanite theology as central a role as some scholars suppose. The Pahlavi religious texts witness an interest for astrology by the Zoroastrian theologians, which, far from being due to a Zurvanite influence, is in line with the attention accorded to time in Zoroastrianism from the Avestan period. The Avestan texts view history as having a predetermined duration and being divided into 2 phases, principally. So a first phase follows the creation of the cosmos by the god Ahura Mazda, or Mazda in Pahlavi, and with this phase the cosmos lives in a state of purity. The second phase, the one during which we are living currently, follows the attack by the demonic forces led by the archdemon Ahriman in Pahlavi. An attack which brings evil and pollution into the cosmos. During this phase, the forces of good fight against the forces of evil, which will eventually be defeated in a final battle that will usher an eternal, that's phase 3, that will usher an eternal period of purity for the cosmos. The subdivisions of cosmic history, sections of the day, of the month, and of the year, are given a great importance in the Avesta, since each of them is a step that brings history closest to its positive ending. an even higher importance, higher than in the Avesta, was given to cosmic history and to its sections in Sasanian Zoroastrianism. For the Sasanian Zoroastrian priests, astrology represented an instrument with which to analyze the course of time. The interest of the Sasanian Zoroastrian priests for astrology is reflected first and foremost by the fact that astrological doctrines were included in the Sasanian sacred text or corpus formed by the Avesta plus the Zand, the so-called Zand. Its commented translation, the commented translation of the Avesta into Middle Persian. This is clearly and explicitly said by one passage of the fourth book of the Denker, Acts of Religion, which is the most important Pahlavi text, whose last version dates from the 10th century. This passage that you find in the handouts and here is pretty long, so I will not read it. So, attributes to the Emperor Shakur I, 240–70 CE, the initiative of gathering texts relating to different sciences, one of which was astrology, and to include them in the sacred scripture. The fictional story told in the passage, as you can see if you read it, is that these writings had been dispersed to India, to the West and elsewhere, and therefore their inclusion in the sacred corpus was just taking back what was originally part of the Avesta. Incidentally, it is interesting to observe that the reference in the passage to the presence in Sasanian Iran of Indian and Western astrological text reflects the structure of the doctrinal corpus of Sasanian astrology, which is known to us from the Pahlavi literature, but especially from other post-Sasanian sources of Sasanian background, principally Arabic texts, but also some Byzantine and Latin medieval texts. These sources show that Sasanian astrology included several original doctrines, but was mostly based on elements of Hellenistic and Indian origin. Like more or less, that's more or less what the passage says. Now, in my following notes, I will reconstruct which astrological doctrines we can attribute to the Zand and how these doctrines were dealt with in the Zand, with the aim of shedding light on the relationship between astrology and religion in the Sasanian theology. It bears remembering that of the Zand literature existing once upon a time, unfortunately only a small part has come down to us. Most of it is commented translation of Western texts that were and are even now used during rituals. In these versions we actually find only a very limited number, here we have 2 out of the probably 3 or 4 references to astrological concepts. This is not entirely surprising though, because these commented translations, those that have come down to us, only usually have a merely technical function. That is, that the commentaries that they include are usually focused on the explanation of the meaning of the original text or contain details of ritual nature. The contents of the lost portion of the Sasanian Zand are summarized in detail in the 8th book of the Denkard. This summary does not appear to make any explicit reference to astrology, which may indicate that the Zand did not contain extensive parts dealing with astrology, but this does not mean that the Zand did not contain any astrological doctrine at all. The lack of mention of astrological doctrines in the Denkard summary can simply be explained by the fact that in the Zand, these astrological doctrines were fully integrated within the treatment of religious themes, and were not perceived by the author of the summary as distinct from them. Information on which astrological doctrines were present in the Zand and the way in which they were integrated into it can be gathered primarily from a group of Pahlavi texts, 9 in total, of miscellaneous context that I will call religious collections. These texts, the most important in the Pahlavi literature, are aimed at providing an overview of the religious knowledge and are based on, or have as a point of reference, the Sasanian Zand. Among the religious collections, particularly relevant references to astrology are contained in the anthologies by the 9th century priest Zoroastrian, the Shtangumani Grisar, which means the decisive solution of the doubts, which is another 9th century text, and especially in the Bundahishn, primordial creation, whose last important reduction probably also dates from around the end of the 9th century. The Bundahishn in particular contains the majority of the astrological doctrines and concepts of the whole group of the religious collections. Most of them are found in its section 5, which appears to be a sort of mini repertoire of the astrological doctrines of the Zand. The references to astrology in the religious collections agree with each other, except on a few points, which may originate from different opinions expressed in the Zand, or maybe due to the opinions of the authors of the text themselves or of the schools to which they belong. Overall, on the basis of the textual analysis, we may conclude that the Zand contained a somewhat limited, interested but limited set of astrological doctrines. Very probably the majority, or if not all of them, were included in the Dandad Nas, which is a section of the Zand, which had of cosmological content. That was one of the main sources of the Bundahishn, and is also quoted in Zoroastrian's text. Well, so let's start with this overview of the doctrine. So present in the Zand was first of all the basic belief of astrology, that is, that the zodiacal signs and the planets influence the course of the earthly events, with the planets being the ultimate distributors of celestial influences. Zodiac and planets were presented as agents in the fight between good and evil. As said above, we encountered this theme already in the Avesta, but in Sasanian theology, the Avestan doctrine of the clash between good and evil celestial bodies was expanded. So the 12 zodiacal constellations were included among the good astral entities. The planets and the lunar nodes, on the other hand, were included among the malefic bodies. Following an Indian doctrine whose first traces in a 4th century Sanskrit text, the lunar nodes were included among the planetary bodies. They were identified as the head and the tail of a celestial dragon that causes the eclipses. The pattern name of this dragon is considered. The fight between good and evil astral bodies was considered, as in the Avesta, part of the fight between good and evil that takes place at all levels of the cosmos after the attack by Ahriman. The planets, or it's probably better to say planetary bodies, are among the evil bodies that enter the cosmos together with the archdemon. So since then, and during the whole mixture phase, each of the planetary bodies is opposed by either the sun, the moon, or a stellar body. By adapting some Mesopotamian and Greek notions to the structure of the late Sasanian army, where 4 generals were in charge of one cardinal direction each, 4 stellar bodies, I apologize about this slide. So 4 stellar bodies and 4 planets were considered as generals of one of the cardinal directions. The luminaries and the stars forbid, according to the doctrine present in the Zand, their evil astral opponent to do too much damage to the cosmos, and so do the course through which the evil astral bodies are tied to the chariot of the sun and the moon, that make it impossible for them to move at will. This latter idea is an adaptation of a notion that we encounter in a Sanskrit text of the 9th century, but which certainly entered the Iranian world in the Sasanian period, that of the winged cords, through which demons pull the planets, and which are the reason for their irregular motion. And precisely the irregular and disorderly retrograde movement of the planetary bodies, which contrasts with the regular movement of the stars, is one reason for their condemnation in Sasanian theology. So here you have in the handouts a quotation from a passage of the Bundahishn, which this is virtually the same reason as that for the condemnation of the shooting stars in the Avesta. But there is another, more astrological reason for the consideration of the planetary bodies as evil. That is, the fact that they were considered as the ultimate distributors of the destiny to the world. As such, they could also be responsible for the bad luck, which in the strictly dualistic view of the universe specific to Zoroastrianism, made it impossible to consider them as benefic creatures. One complication of this radical perspective was that it made it hard to explain how, in addition to bad luck, the planets could conversely distribute also good luck. One explanation for this contradiction expressed in the Humanique Bizarre, is that the planets, can indeed give nothing good, and if they bring any benefit, it is because they have stolen it from the good benefic astral bodies. So, in line with the pessimistic vein that is frequently encountered in the Zoroastrian literature, the text further observes that the planets give good things only to evil persons. According to the Humanique Bizarre, then, whatever good comes to the world originates from the 5 good stellar bodies enemies of the 5 planets. The Wunderhirschen, on the other hand, provides an explanation of a Greek astrological doctrine accepted in Sasanian astrology that was particularly difficult to reconcile with the negative view of the planetary bodies. The doctrine according to which Jupiter and Venus have a benefic nature and Mercury had a neutral nature. The text states that the good nature of Jupiter and Venus is due to their defeat by their enemies, Ursa Major and von Occult, in the initial battle that took place after the evil forces attacked the cosmos, a defeat which obliged them to distribute good. The Wunderhirschen says that Mercury is neutral because its strength is the same as that of its astral adversary Sirius. Saturn and Mars instead were stronger in the initial fight against their adversaries Polaris and Vega, which highlights their malefic nature and more in general highlights the strength of the evil forces after the attack. Another attribute of the planets that the Sasanian theologians strove to reconcile with their negative view of the celestial bodies was their luminosity, which in their view of the universe was an outward mark of a benefic nature. This was in fact an attribute specific not only to the good astral bodies but to all good entities, the attribute of the evil entities being darkness. Explanation provided for this attribute in Cézanne included that light was conferred on the planets by Ahriman so that they could pretend to be good astral bodies and move among them, or that, on the contrary, the planets were surrounded by light by Hormaz, so that imprisoned in it that they could perform less damage. So, in including the zodiac and the planets within the context of the fight between good and evil, the Sasanian theologians made big efforts to match their consideration of the planets as malefic entities with some basic tenets of astrology, the fact that some planets could possibly exert a positive influence, and of astronomy, the observation of their luminosity. On the other hand, certainly astrological doctrines that could not be reconciled with their view of the celestial world were not included in the sacred corpus. One of those was the Greek doctrine that some fixed stars could have a negative influence, a doctrine that we know from, so finally let's speak of something of the Islamic period, now that we know from the Book of Nativities of Zarathustra, an 8th century Arabic astrological text translated from the Pahlavi. Now, the most interesting astrological themes which were present in the Sun related to the moment of the attack on the cosmos by Ahriman and to the first period that followed it. I need to review here some important aspects of cosmic history according to Sasanian Zoroastrianism. The Pahlavi texts specify that history lasts 12,000 years, a duration that incidentally has no astrological implications, because certainly introduced before astrology was even invented. So the attack on the cosmos by Ahriman and his allies took place in the year 6000. Developing the view already implied in the Avesta, the Pahlavi texts explain that the attack, in addition to bringing impurity and evil, which is why it introduced the period called of mixture between good and evil, also introduced into the cosmos multiplicity and movement. Before it, only one representative of each living being existed, that is, one plant, one bovine creature, and a man named Gaioval, who, together with the rest of the universe, stood still. After the attack, numerous living species existed, and the cosmos was in movement. Referring specifically to the moment of the attack by Ahriman was the doctrine of the horoscope of the birth of the world, that is, the beginning of the mixture phase, its present stage of existence. Section 5 of the Wunderhirschen describes this doctrine in detail. The notion of the horoscope of the moment of the beginning of the world's life is witnessed for the first time in classical astrological sources. One of these sources is the Anthologies by Baptist Valens, 2nd century of the Common Era, a text which was well known in Sasanian Iran through a translation in Middle Persian and a later elaboration of it. One major difference between the classical horoscope of the world and the Iranian one is that in the classical sources, the planets are in the sign of their domicile, that is a sign where they were considered to have a particular power. Whereas, in the Bundahish, they are placed in another position where they were considered to have an exceptional power, the degree of their exaltation, with one exception, Mercury. This planet, as you can see, is not in its exaltation, which is in Virgo, but is in Pisces, at 22 degrees from the Sun, in order to save the astronomical verisimilitude. We can reconstruct how in Sasanian Iran the original structure of the horoscope of the world was defined by observing that the Zoroastrian horoscope of the world is identical to that of Gayomar, also dealt with in the Zand. We know this horoscope from the Bundahish chapter 6, as well as from the anthologies of Zafran. The identity, I want to explain, of the horoscope of the world with that of Gayomar is obviously due to the fact that the life of the first man during the phase of mixture, like that of the world, starts with the attack on the cosmos by the evil forces. In Sasanian Iran, Gayomar was assigned the Indian horoscope of exceptional characters, where all the planets are in their exaltation. A reference to this horoscope is found for the first time in a Sanskrit astrological text that we have received in a version dating from the 4th century of the Common Era. This Indian horoscope was then transposed to the world, replacing the classical one with the planets in their domicile. Both in the classical and in the Indian sources, the position of the planets in their domicile or exaltation is supposed to reflect an ideal situation, whereas, ironically, in the Zoroastrian sacred corpus, the horoscope of the world was supposed to have exactly the opposite significance, because since the maximum power of the malefic planets is a sign of the high power of the evil forces at the beginning of the mixture phase. The Zoroastrian view that with the beginning of the phase of mixture, movement is introduced into the cosmos may explain why the classical horoscope of the world with the planets in their domicile was replaced with the Indian horoscope with the planets in their exaltation. Now, some classical astrological texts, one being the already quoted Petrus Valens, associate in fact the domicile of the planets with stability and the exaltation with change. A planet in its exaltation, that is, causes a change of state. A Byzantine text, the theory founding the astronomical art according to the Chaldeans, which was translated from Arabic, so we have Arabic again, into Greek perhaps around 1000 CE, and which has several echoes of Sasanian astrology, in dealing with the horoscope of the world, says that when the planets reached their exaltations, a dragon who carried 6 signs of the ecliptic over his back, the gozir of the Bahari X, started to move. And it also explains that the planets, terrified by this movement, began moving irregularly. Now, therefore, we may suppose that in Sasanian Iran, the horoscope with the planets in their exaltation was chosen, perhaps by the theologians themselves, as the horoscope of the moment of the beginning of the mixture phase, since it was considered appropriate to reflect the condition of movement and change which was introduced by the attack by Ahriman on the cosmos. The horoscope with the planets in their domicile was discarded since it was considered appropriate to rather reflect the condition of stability and lack of movement that preceded the mixture phase. Based on the horoscope of birth of Gayomar, in the Zan was presented an astrological explanation of the doctrine according to which this man died at age 30. So this doctrine is known only from the Bahari texts, but in my opinion it was elaborated long before the Sasanian times, in parallel with the elaboration of the legend of Zoroaster. Gayomar's death at 30 is in fact one of the elements that connect the first man to the prophet. Gayomar is the ultimate ancestor of Zoroaster, and with him constitutes a cardinal point of the history of humanity during the mixture phase. Gayomar is the first to receive from Ormazd the knowledge of that religion of which Zoroaster is the first prophet. Also, 30 is an important age both for Gayomar, for whom it is the age of death, and for Zoroaster, who, according to the legend, at 30 obtains a new birth for himself and for all humans. That is, his first encounter with or master. We must also add that by placing Guillaume's death at age 30, the year 30 from the beginning of the first 3 millennium of the mixture phase connects with the year 30 before the end of the first 3 millennium, when, according to the legend, Zoroaster was born. The Zand explained Guillaume's death at age 30 as due to the mutual position. Sorry for skip the slide. Anyway, explains Guillaume's death at age 30 is due to the mutual position of Saturn and Jupiter at the moment of his birth, and 30 years after that. So, in Guillaume's birth chart, in fact, both planets are in a position of great strength, their exaltation, and following Greek astrological doctrines, the benefic Jupiter is considered stronger in the birth chart of Guillaume than Saturn, the most malefic planet, because Jupiter is placed 90 degrees in the zodiac before Saturn. Therefore, it could postpone, being benefic, Guillaume's death for 30 years. After 30 years, on the contrary, Jupiter is in a position of weakness, whereas Saturn is again in a position of exceptional strength in its exaltation, and 90 degrees before Jupiter. So, and therefore can freely exert its malefic influence. The Pahlavi texts show that the doctrine of Guillaume's death at 30 was not universally accepted in Sasanian and early Islamic era Zoroastrianism. According to some theologians, in fact, the first man died right after the attack, as did the first plant and the first animal. We do not know whether the astrological explanation of the death of Guillaume at 30 was devised by the Sasanian theologians, and specifically by those who adhere to the opinion that he died at 30, but certainly astrology provided support to the latter's stand. The horoscope of Guillaume is the only birth chart of an individual that has come down to us from the Pahlavi literature, and this message is paradigmatic for the fate of all humanity during the mixture phase. The evil planets, and especially their chief Saturn, are ultimately the cause of the death, which is the main affliction for humans. There is finally another that's unfortunately at the end of my presentation I'm talking about the most difficult doctrine. Now, there is another important astrological doctrine that we can definitely attribute to the Zand, that of the millenary chronotratoria. According to this doctrine, which is dealt with only in section 5 of the Bundahishn, each zodiacal constellation from Aries to Pisces, and in the Bundahishn, the focus is, once again, on the 7th millennium of cosmic history, the one where the mixture phase starts. During it, the cosmos is ruled by the 7th zodiacal sign, Lyra. The Bundahishn then says that Saturn became the planetary ruler of the millennium because at the moment of the attack of the evil forces it was in Lyra in its exaltation. It is not easy to reconstruct how the doctrine of the millenary chronotratoria as expressed in the text was developed in Iran. Classical astrological works document the notions that the zodiacal constellation or the planets rule over some periods of time, but the notion of the rule of the zodiacal signs or of the planets over the millennia is not documented in any pre-Sasanian or Sasanian non-Iranian astrological source. The notion of a dominion of the benefic zodiacal constellations over the millennia could be pre-astrological and may have been devised in Iran without any foreign influence after the introduction of the zodiac. The notion that the planets rule over the millennium, on the other hand, could be an adaptation of doctrines originating from the classical culture as well as from classical astrology. In this respect, I must first of all remember that, as in the Zoroastrian scheme, also in the classical civilization, starting from Hesiod's works and days, the first age of humanity is Kronos, Saturn's age. In the classical civilization, this was considered a golden age, and an echo of this view may perhaps be recognized in a curious statement that we find in the Bundahishn, that is, that under Saturn's rule, men were taller, a statement that is hard to match with the negative view of the mixture phase and its beginning, in particular in Zoroastrian theology. Saturn is furthermore the ruler of the first stage of humanity, also according to classical astrology. A system tested in a 4th century Latin text assigns the periods of the life of humanity to the rule of the planets, starting with Saturn, followed by Jupiter, Mars, Venus, and Mercury. It is probable that Sasanian astrology modified a doctrine of this type, adapting it to a millenarian schematization of time. Post-Sasanian non-Zoroastrian sources which contain Sasanian material point, in fact, to the existence in Sasanian Iran of a system that placed planets and luminaries, starting with Saturn, in charge of 1 millennium each. Nevertheless, this system does not match with the one documented in the Bundahishn, according to which the planet, having its exaltation in a zodiacal sign, rules over the corresponding millennium. The system found in the Bundahishn, furthermore, cannot be matched with the Zoroastrian view of the cosmic history. Following this system, in fact, Jupiter and Mercury would be the rulers of the 4th and 6th millennium, respectively. And this is against the view that the planetary bodies entered into the cosmos only after the 6th millennium. One possible explanation is that the doctrine of the rule of the planets over 7 millennia was diffused in Sasanian Iran outside the priestly circles. Of this doctrine, only one point was included in the Zan, that is, the rule of the 1st millennium of the current history by Saturn. Following this hypothesis, the explanation that this planet received the rule of the 7th millennium because it was in Libra would have been formulated a posteriori by the Sasanian priests. And it would not imply that 6 more millennia are ruled both by a zodiacal sign and by the planet that has its exaltation in it. What is certain that assigning the dominion of the 7th millennium to Saturn was a way to underline the strength of the forces of evil at the beginning of the mixture phase. Now, we have observed that the other astrological doctrines found in the Zan were also meant to reflect the idea that the evil forces are exceptionally strong when the mixture phase started, were exceptionally strong when the mixture phase started, but the Bundahishn explicitly puts the attack by Ahriman in relationship with the fact that the sign ruling over the 7th millennium, Libra, is where the Sun, the lord of the good celestial bodies, is most weak. Interestingly, furthermore, the Bundahishn refers to the placement at the moment of the attack of Saturn in the medium Celi, the highest position over the horizon, and of the Sun at the Imu Celi, the lowest position under the horizon, and connects this position with the relationship of these two celestial bodies with obscurity and light, respectively. Parallels to the connections of Saturn with darkness and of the Sun with light, as made in the Bundahishn, can also be found in classical sources, one being Ptolemy's Tetradinos of the 2nd century. So, but in the treatment, sorry, this is a long passage, in the treatment found in the Bundahishn, we recognize echoes of the Zoroastrian connection of the evil forces with the lower part of the universe, where is darkness, and of the good forces with the upper part of the universe, where is light. Now, this overview has shown that a few important astrological doctrines were found in the Zan, which were set within the context of the fight between good and evil forces that is central to the Zoroastrian worldview. Specifically, the doctrines of the horoscope of the world and of Gaioma and of the millenary chronoctoria were in line with and provided support to the idea that the beginning of the phase of mixture, when the evil forces brought the idea that the beginning of the phase of mixture, when the evil forces brought evil and mortality in the cosmos, was the worst moment of cosmic history. Astrology also supported the disputed doctrine that Gaioma died at age 30. Furthermore, the doctrine of the horoscope of the world was in line with the view that the mixture phase was characterized by movement, in contrast with the previous condition of stillness. Efforts were made by the theologians to adapt the negative consideration of the planets with doctrines or observations that contrasted with it. The doctrine that some planets would exert a positive influence and the observation of their luminosity. Doctrines that were irreconcilable with the tenets of the Zoroastrian cosmology were, on the other hand, not included in the corpus. The astrological doctrines that we have discussed had an impact also outside the Zoroastrian community long after the end of the Sasanian Empire. In particular, we find the Iranian horoscope of the world in Islamic, Byzantine, Latin, and Latin medieval astrological texts. On the other hand, the theologians' efforts to explain the luminosity and the positive influence of some planets do not appear to have outlived by much the 10th century within the Zoroastrian community itself. In fact, in the two above quoted New Persian text Ulama Islam and Rivayat of Dastur Bazukandin, these qualities of the planets are explained differently than in the Fatwa literature. The Ulama Islam says that after the attack on the cosmos, the 7 planets were bound by the good spiritual beings to the vault of the sky, and that Ormuzd actually de-demonized them by surrounding them with light and by giving them divine names, replacing the demonic names they had previously. The Rivayat instead presents Jupiter and Venus as non-demons. One might explain these opinions with the possible Survanite ascendancy of these two texts, but more probably they are speculations which were elaborated by the Zoroastrian theologians after the period of composition of the Pahlavi texts, when these texts' treatments on the contradictory qualities of the planets had been obliterated or were not considered convincing anymore. Final note, what is left for us modern interpreters is to appreciate how astrological doctrines of different types were adapted to the worldview of the Sasanian Zoroastrianism, which is one of many demonstrations of the ingenuousness of the Zoroastrian hermeneutical transition and of the intellectual vitality that the Zoroastrian religion has had throughout the centuries. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Enrico, for this really fascinating lecture and very difficult subject. At some point it sounded like a mystery novel of some sort. You have to choose who is good, who is bad on the planet. Really great. And our respondent now comes again from the University of Chicago, from the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations. He is Edmund Hayes, and he is a graduate student here. His research focuses on early Shiism, and his dissertation is entitled The Invoice of the Hidden Imam, Religious Institutions and the Politics of the Occultation Doctrine. Hayes has published recently an article in the last issue of the journal Iranian Studies, where he is investigating the literary construction of pre-modern Iranian lineage-based identity. Ed, please.
Hello. So I was pleased to hear in the previous paper that Noah was given knowledge by the angel Raphael, because I feel that we have now been given knowledge by Professor Raffaelli, which seems to fit well. And thank you for this erudite and illuminating paper. I learned a lot from it. The organisers of the conference explicitly said that they're interested in promoting boundary work, and this is boundary work yet rigorously rooted in a particular tradition. So the papers provided a compelling model for the kind of interaction between what we might call original Iranian Zoroastrian cosmological beliefs and external astrological ideas. Rather than responding to detailed points, I'll suggest a broad framework for engaging with the paper. Your description of the use of which Zoroastrian priests made of astrological doctrines made me think that perhaps our discussion could be framed by appealing to Claude Lévi-Strauss's idea of bricolage. Bricolage is the application of pre-existent, ready-made materials to some new task. The bricoleur is like the handyman who patches a water pipe with the handkerchief he uses for blowing his nose. For Lévi-Strauss, bricolage is, on the intellectual plane, distinctive of what he calls mythical thought, which pieces together the fossils of earlier phases of history and reassembles them into a new system, though never entirely stripping them of meaning. In the history of science, of course, one can take exception to the distinction between a mythical thinking and a truly scientific thinking. Perhaps Professor Melvin Kushki can come in on that one. But it seems to me that bricolage nicely explains something of what the Zoroastrian priests are doing. You give specific examples of the adaptation of an Indian idea that the planets are malefic entities, which is nicely harmonized into the Zoroastrian ideas about the evil genesis of the mixed world. and corroborated by empirical observation for planets are disordered in their motion, just like the shooting stars were in the original model. And then there's the astrological premise that planets govern the destiny of the world, and therefore also its bad luck, which seems to fit in nicely too. But this results in more complex explanations to explain how planets might also have been seen to produce good luck, which should perhaps contradict the idea of planets being malefic entities. We can see how the life of the bricoleur gradually becomes more difficult as the materials being used to fulfill a particular function themselves require further materials to be drawn into the system to support their own shortcomings. Then there's the horoscope of the birth of the world. It's somewhat functional in illustrating the conflict between the forces of good and evil, part of the original system. But it reverses the meaning of its sources, which indicate that the birth of the world is a positive event. The adoption of a classical idea of Saturn as governing the first stage, though again the moral signification of Saturn has to be reversed. First, for the Zoroastrians, it's a negative, or it becomes a negative rather than a positive, and the earliest phase of the world is a negative one rather than a positive age. I was very interested as well, the myth of Charcour, going to collect these materials, the knowledge of astrology and other branches of knowledge, as a way of kind of domesticating the foreign. Again, we might see this as a sort of legitimation of the activity of bricolage. But all this contradiction asks us, well, why adopt astrology? Was astrology considered to be such a powerful tool in spite of the conflict with sort of original Zoroastrian cosmological precepts, that by the late Sasanian, whenever this happened, time, everything had to at least acknowledge the existence of astrology, like people in the humanities now who have to acknowledge that quantitative techniques and big data exists out there, even though perhaps we would rather ignore it. Against the idea that priestly scholars of the Zoroastrian elite are bricoleurs, we might say that instead their materials were fundamentally altered by their subordination to the ruling Zoroastrian theological doctrine, so that it becomes a new system when the materials are sort of melted down to produce a new framework. In this direction, perhaps, I was fascinated by the idea of the synthesis of Sasanian military cosmology, with the generals in charge of one cardinal direction, each with 4 planets being generals in charge of the 4 cardinal directions. This, in a way, suggests a context in which the Zoroastrian system, the political and intellectual system, rejects the disciplinarity of religious scholarship or military scholarship, but it's all sort of subordinate to one fundamental political and theological ideology. And it raises tantalizing questions about the integration of society and discourse across boundaries. So was it a totalizing system in which all of society was attempted to be incorporated within a single system, or do we have multiple models alongside each other? Interestingly enough, you suggest that in fact the Chronicatoria, the rule of the planets over the 7 millennia, was diffused in Sasania outside of the priestly circles. So that was a tantalizing hint that there might be some cross-social discourse there. Was the uptake of astrology in society forced upon the priestly scholars in spite of themselves due to pressures from non-priests? Now I should probably finish up just to allow time for discussion, but I would like to acknowledge that, of course, Claude Lévi-Strauss is not especially fashionable anymore, and some would say that all human thought is bricolage. Though I think it's useful in the sense that we can think of a system as having a certain coherency, and we can answer this question of is it bricolage or not by deciding at what stage does the incorporation of extraneous ideas lead to the denaturing of the original system, or is the central organising thesis powerful enough to forge the materials into a new whole? I noticed that the title of your paper, you tellingly avoided calling it Zoroastrian astrology. Can we indeed talk of Zoroastrian astrology, or is it impossible? Is a synthesis impossible if it requires doing violence to either the founding principles or the central principles of Zoroastrianism, or to astrology as a system itself? I have a number more questions, but I think I'd just like to leave it at that and allow more 4 or 5 people to come in.
Thanks for these comments. So we've started with a kind of summary of my presentation. So there are quite a few questions. I don't know if I'll be able to answer to all the questions and comments. So I'll start from one thing. So I'll start from one question that, I'll probably simplify your question, but I'll say why adopting astrology in the Sasanian period, or maybe if it was adopted before in Iran at some point, why Iranians at some point accepted astrology that was not part of the scientific law originally. In my lecture I've tried to underline how it was functional to religious, to a view of the history, of the cosmic history, as having a beginning and an end. So there is a predetermined duration of time that the Pahlavi text specified as 12,000 years, and studying its subsections is important. So astrology is one of the many instruments to study and, in a sense, forecast the events that will eventually lead to the end of the cosmic history. But so this is actually a very theological answer. So I can also say that astrology was functional, and I think yesterday we were talking a little bit about that, about the use of political astrology. So we do not have to forget that I didn't have time to say this in my lecture, but the Sasanian astrologers invented, we can say, or better, invented the techniques specific to political astrology. That is the use of astrology for political forecasts. The horoscope of, for example, forecasting the events of the collectivity of all Iranians based on the horoscope of the first day of the year, or also, more importantly and more politically, the horoscopes of the rulers that were usually, of course, they were often modified to make it look like the new ruler would be someone who would give glory to the whole country and to the whole world, right? So we could say that there are two sets of reasons. One is the theological reason that I've underlined in my lecture, that is the Sasanian theologians used astrology as an instrument to study time, and the other one was the politicians, the rulers, that used astrology as an instrument of propaganda, basically. And also, Sasanian astrology then became popular among the members of the lower classes because they used it for they were curious to know about their future, like all people who use astrology, who have used astrology throughout time in different cultural contexts. Now, in my lecture, to answer one of your comments, is why, I've tried to make a distinction, to underline that some doctrines were adopted by the priests, at least based on my interpretation. But we can say that sometimes, maybe in some cases, some of the doctrines that I've talked about were not actually priestly, but were diffused outside the priestly circles. Not only the doctrine of the rule of the planets over the millennia, that do not match with the view of the cosmic history, but also, the doctrine, for example, of the horoscope of Gaioma the horoscope of exceptional characters might have been diffused outside the priestly circles, and then the priests took it and included it in the system because it was functional too. Anyways, it's not easy to distinguish it. We can only assume that some doctrines that we find in the text were present outside of the texts. So many of the comments that you've done are actually are very difficult to answer how and when did astrology become in a certain way, where there are more than one astrological system, like one was religious and one not. We do not know. Unfortunately, the sources are so few, so short that maybe someone might argue that presented a forced interpretation in doing this kind of scheme of which astrological doctrines were present in the Zand. So unfortunately, I can't really give any definite answer to your question. One comment that I wanted to add to your comment is regarding the adaptation by Shavur and I think that if you, on page 2 of the handout, where you find the quotation from the Denker, the final lines, the last 2 lines of the quotation is that, Shavur assigned these doctrines again to the Avesta and considered how to include these systems, these scientific systems, in the Mazdian religion. Again, I might be forcing the text to make it say what I want it to say, but I think that it's basically giving out, sort of telling us something. So it doesn't say, the text doesn't say that, and the Shavur or the theologians explained and demonstrated that these systems were part originally of the Avesta, but considered how. So here basically the text is giving us a hint of what happened. How can we actually pretend that these texts were originally part of the Avesta, right? So one thing that I also, just one thing about your comments is that regarding the nature of the planets, actually the planets were not considered evil in the Indian tradition. It's actually in Iran that we find this doctrine. We find it in the Zoroastrian context and in the Manichaean context also we find this. But then we find outside Iran this concept of the planets as evil also in the Gnostic religions, in several Gnostic contexts. So we find, in Mandeism we even find the idea that the two luminaries, the sun and the moon, are evil, which we don't even find in Manichaeism. One last thing that I wanted to say, I have to add something while I was speaking. I'm reminded of something. What I've quoted, the doctrine of the possibly negative influence of some fixed stars that we find in the Kitab al-Mawalid, so in the Book of Nativities, is a Sasanian doctrine. So in this, that's probably the only case where we can really be certain that Sasanian astrology, Sasanian non-religious astrology had some heretic, if we can call it this way, doctrine, that is, the fixed stars are not always and not necessarily positive, they're not always exerted. That's the only case where we can be certain then, but unfortunately due to the loss of the material we cannot have any other certainty. I don't know if that's okay.
We thank you for listening to or viewing our podcast. For more information and for other podcasts, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts. Copyright, University of Chicago Divinity School.